What I want to do today is talk to you about something that most people don't think about and don't really know what we mean when we talk about public administration, or as those of us in our field say, the public administration, okay? Public administration for most people is a mystery. Oftentimes I get the question, do you mean business administration? And I very promptly inform them, no, I do not mean business administration, okay? So what I have done over the years is help to make more prevalent in the eyes, at least of those who are in government, many of whom didn't know they were a part of the public administration, actually become aware of what this public administration is all about in its broader context. These are practitioners that I train primarily, and they come to us because they feel buffeted by the forces and pressures of our governing system, and they know little about it because they've been trained in substantive specialty. I've got doctors and lawyers and you name it, social workers, cops, firefighters, and so forth joining our programs. And many nonprofit administrators as well, who need to know about the governing system because they dispense much of the public service in this country and have for many decades of time. So what I want to do here is highlight the purposes of my book that came out last April, and hopefully will gather attention, at least among professionals and avid students of this very special fellow by the name of Alexander Hamilton. Okay. As I said, I've been studying Hamilton on and off throughout my career. I got my start in graduate school by writing a paper on his Treasury administration, and that set me off, okay, from there. So, first of all, the point here of this speech is to illustrate the centrality of public administration to Hamilton's thought and practice, okay? Even though, and this is kind of like Hamilton himself, few people know who he was, a lot of people thought he was president, they don't know, they didn't know that he was one of the nation's first premier bureaucrat, okay? And that's a hard one to swallow for a lot of Americans today, and I'll explain a little bit about why that might be the case. Secondly, I want to emphasize the inherent political roles that Hamilton had laid out for the public administration. It is very common today, commonly held, that public administration is merely the instrument of policymakers, that it's sort of the on beck and call as the sort of at-will servants of the policymakers, simply carrying out the policies that are determined by the overarching branches of government. Okay? And so this very instrumental view of public administration really does not capture what's really going on in the world of governing, because that's what public administrators are involved in. They're involved in governing. Most people don't realize that well over 99% of our governments, then there are about almost 90,000 units of government in this country, are run by career civil servants, okay? About people with whom I'm enthralled and have the greatest respect for, and I'm also very critical of when they really screw up, because we're human beings and everybody screws up now and then, right? So in any case, I am very attentive to the roles that these people play, and that they are politicians in their own right, but not elected politicians. They are appointed by different means, and in case you didn't know, the Constitution provides for 22 different methods of appointment to public office, only one of which is by direct election. So if you're thinking, for example, as some people do today, that if you're unelected, that you're somehow unaccountable and that you're not a legitimate part of the constitutional governing system, you're just simply mistaken. Okay? Much of this born simply of ignorance about the system. There's a tendency to want to treat the public administration, as I said, instrumentally, and then to the extent that people see public administrators truly governing politically and having political agendas of their own right, and I use the word political here very broadly, not just in terms of electoral politics, okay, but that they have mission politics around the agencies that they serve, and they're very protective of those missions, and they need to be, they should be, You see, Hamilton wanted this very much for his public servants and for the public service that he embodied as one of our founding bureaucrats. And of course, as you all know, he's one of the premier bureaucrats of the founding era, probably, well, clearly the most brilliant, and he had his hands in everything. He had, as you know, so much energy, so much reach, so much intellect, so quick, too quick sometimes for his own good. He got impulsive at times, but nevertheless, what he was able to do as one person under the aegis of George Washington as the first president of the United States is simply remarkable, okay? Establishing the first great institutions, bureaucratic institutions of our society, particularly the Treasury Department, the Bank of the United States, the Customs Service. He helped establish and, with Jefferson of all people, develop the coinage of the mint. And so on. He had his hands in everything, and of course later in his career helping establish the military institutions and very much wanting a professional military, but of course in the founding period few people were going to have anything to do with a professional military, having just thrown off a professional military in the Revolutionary War. So he dealt with a lot of resistance and in a lot of ways to the establishing these governing institutions. He lived his life in constant controversy, sometimes because of himself and the way he presented, but also simply because of the vision he brought to our nation. Hamilton's vision of the commercial republic is one that is suffused with a powerful and pervasive role by public administrators. It is central to his whole understanding of what good governance meant under the Constitution in his day, and frankly what it means today in many respects. Today we live more in the vision and reach of a Hamiltonian model than we do of any other model of government from the founding period. Okay? Jefferson's clearly present in his model and philosophy, more present in many regards than Hamilton's, in the sense of people espousing Jeffersonian values and such, anti-federalist values. We hear about states' rights and all, and these are all traditions that will stay with us. These are conflicting traditions that will live with us throughout our history, I suspect. I don't think there'll be any final resolution to these debates, and that's okay. Politics is about the set of conflicting agendas, conflicting ideas and visions. But if you really want to understand where we are today, you really need to understand Alexander Hamilton and his vision of governance. Okay? So that said, first thing I want to emphasize is that when we read the most famous of essays by Hamilton and Madison and Jay and such, the Federalist essays, we typically read them, I suspect all of you here read them the same way, with attention to the limits on power that we place on the governing system, okay? So we pay attention to checks and balances, separation of powers, and all of those auxiliary precautions that Madison and Hamilton wrote about that, check in so many different ways the discretion of all those who are going to govern us. And this is not simply applying to just the three top branches, the superior branches. This was meant to imply all the way down into the bowels of the governments, the agencies, the bureaucracies of the new government. Ironically, that is not the only main message of the Federalist essays, okay? Though everyone pays attention to the limits on power, Alexander Hamilton and the essays he wrote, and Madison for that matter, in his nationalist phase, emphasized as much the power and reach of the federal government. Now, Hamilton was unequaled in his assertion of what should be the reach of the federal government over the society, particularly over the market system, over the economy, because he was one of the great students of political economy, then a new science emerging from Europe in the previous century or so, and he was a master of that literature and a master at how governments and what roles governments need to play, borrowing from great minds of Europe, the Colberts, the Neckers, the Vattels, and so forth, who had put together principally the financial spines of their countries during the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And Hamilton, seeing the train of thought and seeing the train of developments across into the colonies, realized that we were going to have nothing other eventually than a complex political economy that we would abide through and in. And of course, today, we're there. Okay, so much so that maybe we need to be thinking more about perhaps how we rein it in at points. And Hamilton himself was prescient about this because he understood that as you developed your economy, power would concentrate, particularly in the wealthy, and contrary to the received opinions about Hamilton, he was not simply the unwavering supporter of the rich and well-born and such, that not at all. In fact, at one point in his life, he whispered to his friend John Laurens, "I hate the wealthy." Being a bastard child from Nevis Island, you can understand why he might have some of these kinds of feelings. But nevertheless, he understood their utility. He was going to use them, and he used them very ably, because where else was he going to get the kinds of finances, the resources needed to start an entire new nation under a new constitution? Okay, so here's an irony. In the Federalist essays, the most commonly cited words are public administration. Replete throughout the essays, the subject is the public administration. Few people read it understanding this, but when you do a content analysis of the essays, those two words, public administration, are the most cited and used in the 85 essays. Okay? Who knew? You say, very few people. Okay? Those people today who want to think of the public administration as some later appendage under the Constitution, or even outside of the Constitution, beyond the Constitution's boundaries, that people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt, or you name it, through the 19th into the 20th centuries, that these presidents and other people helped institute in these new agencies, these new, for example, independent regulatory agencies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We come to understand them in many regards as somehow a fourth branch of government. And these were nothing of the kind in the design that Hamilton intended, okay? Hamilton envisioned all of these kinds of independent agencies in his period. In fact, he helped institute them. One of the classic illustrations of this was something called the sinking fund, which many of you probably know about. I see heads nodding, okay? I'm really thrilled that I'm talking to an audience here that knows probably as much about this as I do. So I may be preaching to the saved here, but nevertheless, the sinking fund was a marvelous example of essentially a fairly independent commission, a board, managed by the following board members: the Speaker of the House of Representatives, okay? Secretary of State, eventually he replaced the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. These are the kinds of people who sat on the board, okay? And you might ask, well, how is it that a judge of the Supreme Court sits on an executive-styled agency, in this case a board, okay? And how is it that Hamilton who's a strong executive-type proponent, would support the existence of boards and commissions? Well, he readily supported many different forms and types of government agencies run in myriad ways, depending on the kind of work that needed to be done. The sinking fund was especially important symbolically at the time, because this was the organ that was put in place officially to retire the national debt. And in the founding period, that was a tall order, and the people took it very seriously, including particularly his opponents, and Jefferson especially, who thought of debt as being a violation of natural law, okay, of a moral order of things, that we should somehow encumber future generations with our expenditures today. You see, Hamilton had very different responses to that kind of thinking, realizing that we were setting in place the core institutions that would benefit generations down the road, who should help pay and support for these institutions that would build the political economy, that would make life for everyone, potentially an opportunity for them far greater than ever known in the history of common people, particularly in democratic societies. You see. Now, the sinking fund, Hamilton never intended at the time to, of course, to retire debt, because Hamilton understood in the complex political economy of the day that debt was absolutely central to leveraging the wealth of the nation when you had very little in the way of any real wealth. Specie, gold and silver, in weak supply in this country. Much of it hoarded elsewhere because no one knew what the prospects were in the colonies and now the new states, just exactly what was going to happen, and people weren't going to take their chances with any real wealth, as they called it, real wealth. Hamilton understood that real wealth was really tied up in something called public trust. If you have the trust of the public in a currency, the trust of the public in agencies, the trust of the public in the people running these agencies, and you see a steady, consistent application of policy around them that works to stimulate growth, debt and evidences of debt, as in various debt instruments, which we're all too familiar with from just down the street here a little ways, which can do you in if you're not careful with them. Hamilton understood that if you manage them carefully, that debt will be the source of the greatest wealth imaginable. And so the debt provision of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution turns out to be absolutely central to Hamilton's designs, that debt was going to be the engine. And Hamilton's use of debt was tied up through the operations of the Treasury, the U.S. Bank, and a number of other related institutions at the time, including the U.S. Bank, which became critical to this, where they borrowed money basically to supply the initial capital for the bank. So these are fascinating things that we were basically inflating wealth on a whim and a prayer, and on the hope and the faith that Hamilton thought the federal government could imbue in people in short order in terms of building public trust. Once you trust in the capital, once you trust in the wealth, once you trust in a currency, which few people had any faith in at the time, given the horrors of the inflationary period of the Revolutionary War, the distrust of the continental, everybody knows about the continental dollar, right? Not worth a continental because they devalued instantly. And we had so many other currencies floating around in the country at the time. And Hamilton, in the space of 2 years, helped resolve all of that uncertainty, assumed the debts of the states with great controversy. Fascinating story we could tell at another time over the compromises struck about that. And within 2 years had the attitudes of the American public completely reversed about the confidence in the national government. And here's a great irony again. Hamilton pointed out that the federal government's only chance at establishing this kind of trust and building the trust and affections of the people for a national government was through effective administration. Again, the public administration is central to his designs. Okay? That body of officialdom who would govern these things systematically, consistently over time, so much so that they would become invisible to the average individual in the sense of not realizing all of the myriad officialdom that goes into maintaining this vast infrastructure of public institutions that we have today. Today at the wonderful ceremony, we had the Coast Guard present, an honor guard. What a great bunch. Hamilton's hands all over the creation of the Coast Guard, okay? The founder of the Coast Guard, so treated by the Coast Guard itself. Those men and women in the Coast Guard are people that we rarely think about, we rarely see them unless you happen to be, stopped by a Coast Guard cutter or you need saving out in the, in the territorial waters or what have you, or being boarded because you're doing something suspicious. You see, you don't know that these people exist, okay? But they're out there 24/7, and the rest of the public administration is like that. And these are the kinds of people that I spend my time training, and I'm so proud to be a part of the training of these individuals, bringing them along about their role, political and administrative and so forth, in the public administration, in the governing of our society at all levels. It's such a remarkable thing that we see. So the trust that we've built, even though we have all of this conflict today, which, by the way, is nothing new, okay? Even though we have all of this seeming distrust and seeming gridlock, that 99% of the public service is just steadily producing, showing us results, keeping things consistent. And when the only time we really notice this is when they suddenly, for some reason, fail. And when they do, you're in Flint, Michigan, and you suddenly realize you're drinking lead in the water. You're in upstate New York, and you're realizing there's acid rain, or you're wherever you are in the country. There's some kind of governing response. There's some kind of governing set of solutions, hammered out in compromises, battled over in the electoral branches and in the courts, but eventually settled in the public administration. And the public administration is where we work out most of these conflicts and issues and settle them and operate, again, mostly away from the public eye, okay? You see very little of the press being present at the myriad administrative tribunals, the hearings that go on in our governments all over the country over public policy in the agencies. The agencies make policy, okay? So, in all of this, how did Hamilton conceive of this? Because we typically see our governments as being these separated powers, always sort of battling with each other, and never the twain shall meet, well, poppycock, okay? Because the Constitution was designed for a system of blended powers. Separation of powers, in a way, is a kind of misnomer. It's meaningful, but what the founders really did, and Hamilton was at the core of this, was find a way to blend carefully the powers of the three branches together that would induce cooperation and specialization most of all, and then at the same time promote the ability of any single branch of fighting off the other branches from encroaching on their power. In order to do that, you need to have a little bit of the power of the other branches. So the president, for example, has the veto power. Is the veto power an executive power? No. It's a legislative power. President has legislative power. Why? How? If he didn't have that, how would he ever stop Congress from passing laws that he felt completely off base or whatever, okay? There are all kinds of motives why presidents veto laws, okay? Same thing in the Congress. Take the Senate. The Senate is one of these classic institutions that Hamilton was very careful in thinking about its design, okay? The Senate has the power of advice and consent on what?
Treaties.
Treaties, thank you. Foreign policy, right? Has a lot to do with executive power. There's the Senate, okay? What else does it have power over? Appointments of senior officials, right? That's personnel policy. The Senate has power over personnel policy, and they manage it. And we see it in spades, don't we? And as to how they want to manage it, whether for good or ill, you see? They have the power, executive power, to meddle in the administration, and they share that power with each other, and then they also delegate shared powers down into the agencies. How many of you have ever heard of something called administrative law? Okay? Administrative law is the largest body of law we have in this country. You could take all of the statutes, the legislative laws, and the Constitution itself, and all of the statutes of the 50 states and put them all in this room, no problem. You'd have to fill building after building after building down Wall Street here and Broadway to fill up all the administrative law. It's the largest body of law we have in this country. Humongous. okay? Millions upon millions of pages of codes and regulations, okay? Hamilton envisioned just these kinds of rules and regulations, and he battled with Congress at times, and Congress debated amongst themselves about just how much of these kinds of powers the Treasury should have. And the Treasury, they very carefully designed the Treasury. Why? Because they handle the money. And who has the power of the purse? Congress, right, and particularly the House of Representatives. You see? Budgetary power? Today we would like to tell people, well, that's an executive power. Oh, I beg to differ. Okay, yeah, the executive wants an important role and should have an important role there. It's the legislative branch that has the power of the purse, principally. Okay? So they delegate these powers, and they delegate legislative-like powers into the branches to make them conduct hearings to pass those rules and regulations. Hearings? That's what Congress does, right? So do public agencies, you see? They also hire people and delegate powers to adjudicate disputes in these agencies. They have administrative law judges. They have hearings officers at all levels. Those are judicial-like officials. And they're in the executive agencies, and they're in the non-independent agencies, you see? They hear all the disputes arising under the rules that come up and are in place, you see? That's where the vast majority of the three powers are exercised, are in the agencies, in the bowels of our governments, okay? Day in and day out. Any of you heard of the Federal Register? I imagine many of you have. Yes, the Federal Register is the legal newspaper, of the federal government, okay? It can be pretty sizable each week, okay? It's now all online. I'm old-fashioned here. I'm still paying attention to paper volumes, but nevertheless, these are basically the notices that go out to the public about proposed rules. And then we have all kinds of hearings, legislative-like hearings in the agencies ready to pass these laws. So Hamilton envisioned all of that through the Treasury, first and foremost. He wrote rules and regulations. He had people under him writing rules and regulations. And here's another thing. He didn't have all of his subordinates just answering to him. One in particular, the Comptroller of the Treasury. Anybody know who the Comptroller of the Treasury is singly responsible to? Congress. Congress. Okay? So how does that work? We've got a congressionally supervised employee, Comptroller of the Currency and a Comptroller of the Treasury in the Treasury Department, which is, by the way, not even dubbed an executive department. The other two departments at the time, War and State, were dubbed executive agencies, but not the Treasury. Now, later, I believe it was in a compensation law passed about the Secretary of the Treasury, they named the Secretary an executive official. Hamilton very much wanted that. But Hamilton was a wise head. He understood the logic of this system, and he understood what bureaucrats could do in a way that might bother some of you, but pay attention to how important this is. He was able to play off Congress and the President from time to time when he didn't happen to like what they were wanting him to do. If the President did something that Hamilton wasn't particularly pleased with, and that happened even under the Washington administration, he went over to Congress. He chatted with those folks. He'd get Congress to do his bidding. You see? They'd come back, on a presentments clause to the President, and the President's going, wait a minute, and he'd sign off. You see? Same thing when Congress was interfering or trying to interfere in Hamilton's Treasury affairs. He'd use Washington, you see. He would play the superior branches off against each other. This was a part of normal practice in the founding period. Jefferson noted this with alarm, of course, about Hamilton, that he seeks with pleasure to use the Congress for his purposes, and when they don't suit him, he goes to the President. He was just complaining and complaining. Of course, Jefferson did the same thing. So, anyway. So here's the thing. The vision that Hamilton had of the public administration then was one of the superintending branches of the government superintending as a superstructure the operations of the subordinate agencies, all three branches. The judiciary. I don't know how many of you knew that the judiciary routinely handled executive matters out in the field in the states in the early going. Okay? They were the only officials oftentimes present because they rode circuits. Think of the Supreme Court justices today if we made them ride circuits out among the states. Wouldn't that be just a hoot to have that? I'd love that, okay? But they don't anymore, obviously. And the judiciary hated this duty, but they went out and it was routine for them simply to exercise executive power out in the field, authorizing actions by customs agents, by all kinds of postal agents, all kinds of people, federal employees out there in the states, in the rural burgs of the country. Okay, the judiciary, of course, also engages in supervision of agencies through things like remedial orders. A remedial order by a court, particularly the Supreme Court, is an order to say this administration has fouled up, say, for example, protecting the rights of prisoners in Alabama. Okay, we're going to make the state of Alabama completely rework its administration of its prisons. We're going to force them to fund those prisons more satisfactorily and to run those places with an eye to protecting the rights, yes, even of prisoners. You see? How does that happen? Or you have a water dispute, say, out there in the West where we don't have a lot of water, between two states. And they'll set up a special master. How many of you have heard of the special master? Or you've heard of judicial magistrates, which are judges in their own right, okay? And yet they also have executive power, you see. So Hamilton was envisioning these three branches as participating and delegating down their powers and their processes and their values into the public administration. And these public agencies then go out and exercise those three powers for narrowed purposes together. Now you might ask, well, isn't that an improper fusion of all three powers? You see? Well, Hamilton and Madison and others understood, and Madison wrote about this specifically in the Federalist essays, that no, you need the fusion. The further down you go, to the street level especially, those powers need to be fused, but they're very limited in their scope. So any particular agency that we have does not have a roving brief, okay? They can't just go out and make rules about anything and everything. No, if you're in the Customs Service, you can only do things with respect to the purview of the Customs Service within its mission, you see? So you have mission-specific powers where you share all three. So that's kind of the broad vision of what he had in mind, okay? And so if we study public administration today, as I do, and teach it to professionals, people out there in the field, perhaps like many of you, the things that we're helping them understand is how those powers blend, how they operate among the superior branches, and then what roles they play. And these roles, and I'll wrap up with this and we'll take some questions and whatnot, but this is the thought I want to leave you with. Hamilton, though he was all about, in many ways, a strong executive, and this is what so many people today tout, including people who are advocates of something called the unitary executive, which Hamilton in no way envisioned, okay? But nevertheless, strong, powerful executives running things, okay? His view, Hamilton's view, was that these executive officials need to be tethered and restrained in the sense of to the principle of rule by law. Okay? Central to everything he did. He was one of the greatest lawyers of his generation. His jurisprudence was put into effect in precedence by subsequent Supreme Courts, starting with Chief Justice Marshall, Justice Story, and so forth, who were great legal minds of the 19th century. And they took many of his precedents and put them into our jurisprudence. Okay? But here's the point. He said very unequivocally that public servants do not take an oath of any kind to support the president, okay, to obey the president. They take oaths to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States. And as a result of this, Public servants enjoy a sufficient amount of discretion as officials under the Constitution to resist unjust and illegal actions by superiors of all stripes, including the President of the United States. And this is in part why the dramas we've seen unfold today around the impeachment of our President and the testimony of key public administrators in the State Department is so critical to what is going on, and they were fulfilling their role, their constitutional role, by calling forward an alarm about the actions of this particular president. That's the kind of work that an Alexander Hamilton would envision of today's responsible public service. With that, I'll wrap up. There's much more I could say, but I'm happy to take questions and enjoy mixing with you today and tomorrow at the Grange. So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Okay, here and then here. Okay. They politically appointed by the Senate, from the President to the Senate, all swear the same oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the country. Good question. Okay, if we look back to previous impeachments and we look back on other controversies where the testimony of subordinates was required, in general, those subordinates have complied. Only in this administration are we getting this abject refusal on all levels for any kind of going along with this. Now, this can ultimately be tested and decided by the Supreme Court, which in a way I hope it is. I hope it does because, and I hope that this court is ready to reinforce the precedents established, for example, under U.S. v. Nixon, that famous case, and others that basically compelled the testimony of various underlings, including political appointees, many of whom complied. Okay? Many a president has invoked privilege, of course. And in the arena of foreign affairs, there is a fairly wide latitude for the president and his subordinates to refuse to testify on the basis of the president's executive privilege, not the executive privilege of subordinates. Okay? So this is a murky area, and it's one which there's enough play and uncertainty in and around this that a president like a President Trump today can get away with this for a while. We'll see how long. Okay? Again, just because we hold these in high principle doesn't mean everybody wants to observe them, and in many cases they're going to seek to ignore these things. And in this case, basically sadly, the White House is just completely ignorant of these things. There are people around the president who know better. But they're not going to play that card, and they're not going to take that seriously while they're in that role. Partly this is due to the intense loyalties of party, perhaps intense loyalties to a person and such. This is a hard thing to reconcile. Think about this. I'm not entirely critical of all officialdom at these levels, folks. I have great respect and sympathy for them, because put yourself in this position. You have a president, you have members of Congress, you have a party coming in with strong policy preferences. They've been elected. They do have, I hate the word mandate because few elected politicians really have a mandate. They're almost always elected by a minority of the voting population, okay? Because most of the voting population doesn't actually vote, okay? So that said, nevertheless, you want to give them their due, okay? Even if you don't agree with them, if you don't like them, we should give them their due. But that can only go so far. And we've seen the perverse effects of this in this current era. Yes, sir. Hamilton's vision of the commercial republic is a fascinating one, based in both political economic theory and practice, as well as in law. Okay? The commercial republic he viewed as being essential to a people in a republic of diverse backgrounds and religions and so forth, who you could not unite in some small, republic with homogenous people and such that many of our anti-federalists desired, okay? You had to have something that would encompass the broad backgrounds, religious, philosophical, and so forth, of so many different people, along with all of the diverse interests of people coming as immigrants, ignorant of things political, ignorant of the culture here, who would come in and need a way to find a leg up and show promise to them, which is what America's been famous for much of its history, is a land of promise, right? We would like to think, and some of us would wish it were a little such that was the spirit today. Unfortunately is not. But nevertheless, the Republic was a place where, in Hamilton's vision, you would create through a complex political economy myriad opportunities in commerce, in the arts, in the sciences, in the nonprofit world of service and such, the opportunities and pursuits for a vast majority of common people. Hamilton was first and foremost, contrary to popular wisdom or lack thereof about Hamilton, he was a great advocate for the common person. And he was a great advocate for the freeing of slaves. He was a great advocate for common people in every sense of the word, except when they were welled up and driven into the mob-like mentality that we can see from time to time in our country. That's what he detested. That's what he feared, okay? But in balance, he had great faith in the American people, and the political economy was designed for them, okay? The law part of this has to do with the idea of a procedural republic. How many of you have heard of this term, a procedural republic? Maybe not. Okay. A procedural republic, folks, is a republic suffused by all kinds of legal mechanisms, processes, through which people can live their lives and affect their livelihoods. So you need lawyers and you need administrators with legal acumen who are overseeing the creation of various instruments, debt instruments, investments, legal wills, estates, all those things that we think of in the legal practices. Hamilton was one of those new lawyers who understood that it's not so much oftentimes the ends of the law that matter, but the processes for getting there, you see. And that these myriad legal processes that we all engage in throughout our lives were the things that would help order the political society and the political economy. You can't be in business here on Wall Street. Well, I take this back. In some eras, we've had people on Wall Street who had no restrictions by law whatsoever, and we've been paying the price dearly for that. There are myriad kinds of regulations and processes that normally we would want these people to use, such as, for example, just keeping written records of the kinds of deals that you construct rather than conducting things like dark markets. Yes, sir. Very good question. This was important. Hamilton was a big believer in federalism, even though he was often viewed as being the guy who wanted to get rid of the states, and create a unified authority of the federal government. Clearly, he was for supremacy of law, as we have in the Constitution, of the federal law over state law and such. But at the same time, he understood that administration, you have to think of it not just at the top levels of design, but right down to the street level. And he knew that the states and localities would be the vehicles, the organs through which much of federal policy would become a reality. So he was very cognizant of the role that these people would play. And as such, the Customs Service became absolutely central in this because they were out there, they were among the few public employees out there in the founding period who were there at the street level, who knew what was going on, taking in the money, and he taught these folks the proper demeanor for public officials in a republic. He says, I don't want to see an ounce of haughtiness, of officialdom. I don't want you to be imperious. I want you to be respectful because these are your fellow citizens, you see? And so you are respectful of them. That's the tenor with which we serve them. And here's the thing. We're going to balance firmness in the enforcement of customs laws, for example, with a modicum of mercy, a modicum of understanding and compromise. Hence, they, for example, would be allowed to grant bonds and evidence of debt to someone who owes customs duties in a particular short-term period who didn't have the money flowing yet from the materials that they were going to be selling, and give them a little time with a bond to pay this back. You see? This is a marvelous example of how you accommodate at the street level the needs of folks, from fishermen and women to people trading and bringing in goods from various countries to exporting them and so forth. You need a little give and take. You need some push and pull. And Hamilton was prepared to give the discretion to these folks at that level to do so. At the same time, he took the Customs Service from essentially a backwater, not very much trusted and liked, to being one of the most respected services in the country because they became so consistent with new procedures, new rules that were clear, consistently applied, and everybody began to trust in the process. That's the procedural republic, okay? That's what we're getting at by that. Other questions? Yes, sir. The founding generation did undervalue the Supreme Court. The reason they undervalued the Supreme Court was, one, as I mentioned before, nobody wanted to be on the Supreme Court of any great note who had great ambitions, because you had to go out writing circuits, and it was pretty well understood that there weren't going to be any truly significant cases. They'd be rare that you'd be dealing with in those early years. Now, they were wrong about this in the short run. There were a couple of cases, particularly that Hamilton was involved with, that were very important. And then, of course, 1803 brings you Marbury versus Madison. And suddenly the courts, become screaming into prominence, you see. But until then, a court appointment, and Hamilton had been offered the Supreme Court justiceship by Washington upon his stepping down from Secretary of the Treasury in 1795. But instead, Jay goes on, and Jay had a lot of other reasons for doing so. But here's the thing. The founders did not view this separation of powers to be so rigid that you couldn't take a judicial official who had diplomatic skill and say, I want you to go, because what judges had a lot of spare time when they weren't riding circuits, okay? There wasn't much for them to do at the Supreme Court level, okay? So you send them to Europe as a diplomat, you see? That's how that could work. And these kinds of give and takes between the branches was normal. That was normal, okay? Today, and really into the 19th century beginning, there was a much more sort of a rigidifying attitude about some of those things. For example, the Supreme Court eventually would stop offering advisory opinions. They have the discretion to do so, but they eventually adopted the doctrine, no advisory opinions, you see? But in the founding era, in the first administrations, they went to the courts and asked for advisory opinions on a routine basis, you see? So this was a fluid kind of operation. Another one where there was supposed to be a lot more collaboration and cooperation between the Senate and the presidency, because the Senate was envisioned not just simply as a legislative body, folks, but also as part of the executive establishment. They were to be the replacement of what were called, there was once a constitutional council that was to advise the president. That didn't get passed into the Constitution. But the Senate, at that time, with 13 colonies, you got 26 people, that's a nice-sized advisory body for the president. Well, the presidents tried and started using, and Hamilton advised him to use them aggressively as counselors. Washington went and sought their advice, and for a short few months, he got it. But then, the politics of partisanship, of course, was crystallizing rapidly in the first administration. And suddenly, these members of Congress were feeling like, wait a minute, this president is just all too convincing and powerful, and he has too much respect out there. He's going to dwarf us. And so they stopped collaborating. And finally, Washington got so fed up with him, he says, a pox on your house. I don't want anything. I'm not going to invite you again. Okay? And this has been much the attitude since. Okay? Still, the Senate today, there are many a senator who advises the presidents unofficially. Is still the case. Okay? The Senate has never really lived up to its intended role very very robustly, and this is the good reason why we subjected the Senate in the 1917 to popular vote. Prior to that time, the Senate was elected by our state legislatures. Now, the theory behind that, Madison tells us, is, well, we want the wisest heads in our state legislatures to pick that individual, you see, that senator, okay? How many of you would go to your state legislative assemblies and say, oh yeah, please select your senator for it? Yeah, you see what I mean? This is why increasingly we democratized ourselves under the Constitution. And this is the spirit of the American people. We are not the republic of the founding period anymore. We're much more democratical, small d, in our spirit than they were at that time. So, that's it. Now, I've been promising to get over here to you guys. Oh boy, I deal with this, I do address this in the last chapter of the book, okay? It's a hazardous enterprise to speculate about the thoughts of founders 260 years ago and how they might see this. The way I conclude it is, of course, I take the safe professor's way out of this, which is to say that there would be a mixture of utter shock and devastation along with utter amazement and wonder. Now, especially for Hamilton, because as I said, this country more than any other founder, this country fits the image that Hamilton would have was supporting. Okay, we got this way through many other different means than just simply his. As you all know, Hamilton was not highly revered in much of our history. So when you borrowed his ideas, he was seldom cited. His ideas have flown under the radar and then resurrected, and sometimes called Jeffersonian or called something else, Madisonian or something else, and it's a Hamiltonian idea. You see, and then of course you take Hamilton and resurrect him as the great hater of the mob and of the people, and therefore the great supporter of the wealthy and rich. So even if FDR uses this, he painted Hamilton as sort of the father of the royalists. You see, and he was attacking the royalists in the New Deal period. And at the same time, he was using Hamilton's legal doctrines through his advisors. To resurrect to build the powers of the New Deal on the General Welfare Clause, on the Commerce Clause, on the Contracts Clause, you name it. You see, so this is how we proceed. Okay, so my answer is a mixture. Okay, they could never anticipate all the things that happen. Yes. Excellent question. Now, let's talk about this thing we've been describing. This, now, if you're a subscriber to the deep state conspiracy theories, this is the bureaucracies out there are this monolithic, tower of professionals secretly, shepherding their agendas and whatnot, and doing exactly the things you've described, right? Okay. Well.
Describe them that way without.
You don't have to be you don't have to be but that's sort of the extreme, okay? But nevertheless, your point is so well taken, okay? First of all, this bureaucracy, this public administration we're describing, how many public agencies do you think we have with separate jurisdictions and separate interests and what? How many do you think we have? Well, we already know we have almost 90,000 units of government in this country, okay? 90,000. Okay, so that's just a start, okay? Then you take within those units of government the various separate agencies and programs, and so you're talking hundreds of thousands, right? Do you think they speak with some kind of unified voice? No. Have you ever heard of bureaucratic infighting, bureaucratic turf wars? Just try the military. You might think of the military, oh boy, big uniform, unified body. Oh my gosh. I've spent time working with those folks at various times in my life, training these folks. I don't know how they hold the Department of Defense together. They are at each other's throats all the time. This is part Madison and Hamilton's answer to your question, part, not total, is that there's so many of them. It's such a diverse field, and their interests are much like the populace, representing the populace of the country. And so the theory in Federalist, in Federalist Essay 10 about factions that Madison wrote about also applies to the bureaucracies at all levels. Do you think the state bureaucracies love and embrace their federal counterparts and just want them to come in-house and share their duties together? Not a chance, okay? Those rivalries are deep, okay? So you have these kinds of checks and balances in part, and then you have all the myriad from the three branches, the checks and balances. Think of all the reporting. There's a concept that I use sometimes called hyper accountability, okay? Ask a typical bureaucrat from any agency how many different reports, how many different kinds of ways in which they're held accountable for what they do just in a given month. And the time they spend writing reports, being inspected, being watched and such is phenomenal, okay? There's another partial answer to it. The other part is a concession to you. Yes, they can abuse power too. And they do from time to time. And when they do, we need to call them out on the carpet. And more often than not, it takes longer, but we catch them. And when we do, they pay dearly. That's the other part. Yes, sir. I can tell you this. Hamilton's view of representation was such that he hoped that many in Congress would become regulars because he wanted them to enjoy in Washington some distance from the immediate pressures of their constituency for just even brief periods of time. He knew that because of short terms of office that members of the House would have to come back and constantly be responsive. But his view of representation was what we call the Federalist view, which is not that they were to be a mirror of society. That was the anti-Federalist view of representation. The Federalist view of representation was, no, we want people who have a little bit of a chance to get some breathing room away from the pressure of their constituents and take a big picture look at what's going on, okay? So the more time you can spend, the better. You see, you can get a bigger national view. So now, this theory breaks down in part. I mean, their theorizing didn't work all the time, and this is another one where these theories of representations aren't consistently, working to our benefit. Okay, that view also is the kind of thing that we see when you have safe seats, and you have in gerrymandered seats where these people eventually are, in essence, unaccountable for what they're doing, and that should bother us too. This is why I have great sympathy as well for the anti-Federalist view, which is they really need to continue to be like us. They need to mirror who we are. I have great respect for the anti-Federalist. Oh, I'm sorry, she's pushing me out here. Thank you very much. Thank you.